So, yeah, in terms of introducing myself, I am Brian Lucid. I'm a professor of interaction design, and right now, currently in New Zealand. I think I'm actually New Zealand's only professor of interaction design. I started my career as a type designer, and while I love type, I now understand that I was drawn to type because I was actually really interested in building and developing tools for other designers to use. And so it was a natural evolution for me then to move from drawing of letters into other forms of tools that users sort of interact with. So that led to the web and app development and sort of the interaction design space that I'm in currently. Now that being said, from an educational standpoint, I've got the great pleasure of leading the Wellington School of Design, which is a 130-year-old design school that's fairly comprehensive. So I'm responsible for communication design, certainly, but also for fashion design, textile design, industrial design, spatial design, photography. And so, I'm responsible for all teaching and research within that institution, and it's a really exciting place. It's considered one of the top 100 design schools in the world.
Let's just talk about your teaching for just a second. Do you think that design can be taught? I mean, are there some people that just don't get it, or do you think that once students start to see a few things that, I mean, obviously you think design can be taught or you wouldn't be teaching it, but
right.
How much of it is talent versus learning how to see properly?
I think very little of it is talent. And I think that's a real, often when students sort of show up at school, that's something that they really labor under, and often don't recognize that what they see as talent is actually just seen as sort of hard work or just work that someone has put into that as a discipline in some other aspect of their life. Like very, very few students just naturally pick it up and just it flows from them. I think we've seen, it's really quite interesting to see the role of also sort of design thinking and the way that that's been integrated across business. Because now all of a sudden we've been able to take some of our processes and philosophies and methods and modes of thinking and apply that external to design with great, great success. But it's also disconnected it from the making. And so, it's really sort of two aspects. It's a way of thinking, but that way of thinking has grown from traditional ways of making. And so from an educational standpoint, I'm still very, very much rooted, and the school, is very, very much rooted in sort of traditional making and craft at the beginning, because those are really essential skills, and those absolutely do take time. So, design isn't something that someone just immediately picks up and, has a facility for, but often real skill and sensitivity is going to grow from that natural evolution of making. And now that making may be in a communication design context, working with typography and color and that. It could be in a fashion design context, and that process of going through and learning how to construct a garment, or it could be in a product design context in terms of modeling and shaping things in 3D. So each of those teaches related skills. But no, I think that anyone with a passion and an interest for design can absolutely go and work within it as a space.
And what kind of a process do you teach specifically for designing for the screen? I mean, how would you describe that process?
Oh, well, there's a few different pieces in that, because there's a lot to the phrase designing for the screen, right?
Yeah.
And there's many roles within that. So, in my own practice, I'm in a very privileged place because I get to work in a very speculative way, right? So when I'm doing work, I am often armed through research, often research done by others. Sometimes, sometimes I'm part of that process. But then I'm able to sit back and then work in a very speculative way, in a way that actually has a great deal of play. I can sort of imagine a product and allow that to sort of develop and transform into a prototype. Now, that may be a very, very different design process than one which is focused on refinement. And, again, as designers, we often are in, many different ways of working depending on the type of product and where the product is even in its development. So, certainly in a refinement process, then it's a much more focused on that sort of really deep feedback loop of making changes, being able to observe how users interact with that work, feeding it back, making changes, that sort of iterative, rapid prototyping sort of development, which is a very different process. And so, of course, in terms of teaching, we have to teach a little bit of both, right? We have to teach the usability and the function and understanding the core of data-driven design. But we also want to teach that the speculative part. The how does this connect to a wider concept? What can it be? How do we sort of push the boundaries of what the expectations are for that as an application? And so, across a series of courses, we'll sort of have to move back and forth between the two. Often we'll probably deal with a lot of the detail work and the technical work earlier. Just like, teaching typography, we learn to do spacing and scale and hierarchy first. And then we start to learn how to play. Then we start to say, all right, now that we have those tools and we have those skills in our hands, then we can then think about how then it's applied in more complicated and conceptual ways.
So I think that what this chapter is about is more about the refinement part, about that iterative process of, making some choices, getting some feedback, and then revising and comparing and looking. And so I think you nailed down exactly what I was trying to get at.
Okay. So one question I would have for you, because I think this is a very challenging one for a lot of design programs, is that, and may not be appropriate for the scale and scope of your book, is I think that the majority of designers that we have leaving design school today are not really prepared for data-driven design. The fact that the majority of design that we have today is generating real-time metrics in terms of usability. And so it's not just about designing something and putting it in front of somebody and saying, oh, do they like it? But, actually being able to develop a trail of use data, over time, being able to observe that data. And then, basically, the majority of applications that we use on a day-to-day basis are A/B tested nearly all the time, right? And so the idea is that actually as a designer in that context, you need to be very plugged into being able to understand sort of the data science of the results that are coming back, and then how that then transforms into, either small or large changes, often very, very small changes. So the, sort of that concept of digital marketing, which has nothing to do with UI, maybe it sort of does. But the things that's grown from digital advertising and digital marketing in terms of techniques has now been sort of captured by, or has been sort of taken on by companies, doing product development. And that's been completely transformative. It's been completely transformative, but it's a completely different process than the traditional sort of creativity-based process.
But I think that it makes design a lot less subjective in a lot of ways, because you have, by changing the color of a button or something like that, that's going to impact how many clicks you get. Is that the kind of data-driven information you're talking about?
It can be, yeah. I mean, certainly, in an application context, it's a lot more. It's a lot more complex. I think that we, I'm torn because you're right. It's a lot less subjective, but at the same time, I think as we've seen, again, this is when I start to go into very deep opinions. I think that's the reason why we saw the web die. The web is not a particularly interesting place. It's a really useful place. When I became a designer, and for many years of being a designer, the web was a really interesting place. It was a place where we grew it and shaped it and experimented with it and played with it. And it was a real place of creativity. And that's why many designers even became designers, because they realized, like, oh, there's a space here that's sort of it's a bit of a blank canvas, and we can sort of figure it out. What we've seen today in the radical kind of templatization of the web is that now it's incredibly important for business, incredibly important for communication, but it's not a particularly interesting place in terms of experiences and design anymore. I have very little interest in designing for the web anymore. We all know sort of what websites look like, and with the exception of a few studios that are doing some interesting work, it's become a very different medium, and part of that is in some ways because we've set sort of narrow parameters of success, and then we measure against those, and then we wind up in a place where now everything is generally exactly the same. It's sort of the bootstrapping of the web, and I think that's a real danger. I think that can be a real danger, because certainly, one aspect as a designer, of usability, absolutely, but there's also that responsibility to sort of engage and delight, and the truly data-driven aspects of design have a tendency, or have the ability of washing that away if people aren't careful.
Mm-hmm. So you're teaching interaction design. Where is the opportunity for creativity in interactive media, in play, and all of that? And when you were talking about this, all of these images of these like crazy Flash websites from the early 2000s that were really experimental and wacky, and those have gone away.
Yeah, all of that has gone away, and even beyond Flash, if we think of the tools and the power that the web has today, we still haven't regained that. Even though you could argue that we have better tools than Flash to create truly dynamic and interactive things. And also, what Flash did is that it gave designers a tool for experimentation. It gave them an open door to play. And we have all of those things today, but we haven't seen the same result. And it's quite an interesting thing. Part of it is because of the technical hurdle part of it is because we now have very fixed jobs. A front-end developer is maybe doing a very, very different role than, someone who's focused on content. So there's a lot less authorship within the web in terms of scale. There are still a lot of places to play. Interestingly, and this is changing as well, which will get us to a whole other thing, aspect of what's happening in design today. But for a while, it was really focused around entrepreneurship. It really became a space to play around sort of platforms and business models. For many years, a lot of design schools were really, really sort of playing with this idea of, sort of like, startups. How do we, entrepreneurship? How do we create new products and have students sort of come up with ideas and bootstrap those into the world? And there's a lot of excitement in that, but there's also a lot of solutionism. There's a lot of, I have this thing, so I'm going to make it as a product, and we have to sit down and say, do we actually need that as a product? Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a place to play there, and there's new spaces. When we think of the changes that we have or maybe I've seen in my own career in terms of the changes in technology, mm-hmm. each of those changes has opened up a new space for play, but it's been a slightly different space. right? So, I started, sort of sad to say, in the days of CD-ROM, right? So even before the web. Those were the days of Flash. And it was, very much screen-based, but it basically extended print into sound and movement and interactivity, branching, and, very simple forms of interactivity. And then those platforms became sort of globally networked. So now they're able to communicate with each other, right? That allows, things like a lot more gaming, but also cloud-based services, information design. And, there's a certain chunk of work that's still in that space. There's a lot of work being done right now design-wise, around, cloud-based services, communication-based services, all of that kind of stuff. And it's very interesting stuff. Then, of course, we sort of move into the mobile age, right, where we went from these sort of big sort of meta projects into very small interactive experiences that were on our phones or, sort of on mobile devices. But what was really interesting about that is the fact that now these devices are always connected to the internet and we carry them on our body. So the internet now comes with us. And that means that they're focused experiences, they're always on, they're always connected, and they're situated in space and context, right? So that the phone knows where you are. So that was the new space to play. Is to, something as simple as being able to say, "Show me restaurants near me," is a fundamental shift from even what the web was, right? So that's that extension to play. I think in terms of where we go next, there's a couple of different spaces. It's a big buzzword, and I think we have to be really careful about it. But there's a lot of really interesting opportunities in sort of the artificial intelligence space, which, in terms of my own students, for a creativity context, I really like to sort of describe as things to think with. So, we want to be thinking of this not in terms of, this computer is going to become smart and take my job, but how am I going to be able to better collaborate or work with this technology as a collaborator as opposed to something that's a bit more passive. We're already seeing design tools that function in that way. And then for me personally, the shift or the next shift that I've been very interested is the shift away from the devices we carry, like mobile, and shifting to the things that we wear. So particularly virtual, but mostly mixed reality. I'm interested in mixed reality because it is a medium that's very similar to the web when I first came to the web. It's a platform with a tremendous amount of possibility that still is undefined and needs to be explored and needs to be teased out and challenged. And that leaves a lot more space to play. And so, certainly that's not about employability, but from a design aspect, how do we find new spaces to be doing work in? That's generally the path that I've sort of taken. And when we think about things like mixed reality, it brings all of the things that everything from the web and everything from app, but now issues of field of view and focus and how much attention we have to work with, and so it adds a whole nother aspect of challenges that are really interesting.
Okay, well, you're talking about really big ideas, and I have more little questions because I remember how amazing you were at helping me with my typography in my thesis document. But for a beginning designer, which is what this audience is, what process did you have when you're designing more traditional interactive media? Are every project that you do driven by some kind of a concept, which is what leads you to your color palette and your type choices? How do you hone in on those choices?
So I think, from the very, very core, it has to sit. It has to grow from a human-centered context of design.
Okay.
Okay. And that's the chewy center of everything. So moving away from visual language, from concepts, from all of those things. And admittedly, this is something that's very much rooted in UI and UX, right? This was our big transition from, perhaps, I may be being a bit unfair here, print design into interaction design, is that we actually had to learn a lot from industrial designers and architects, right? Mm-hmm. And while certainly there's a lot of human-centered design aspects, even in print design, that transition, all of a sudden we were creating things for use. And for many years, a lot of designers really couldn't, or had challenges getting their head around what that really is. And so, it's really important today for a beginning designer to understand that, at least in this context, it's not about, while there are aspects of, self-communication and things like that, it really is rooted on this human-centered focus, right? So first and foremost, before any of that other work has to be done, we have to identify sort of like, what are we trying to do? Who is using it? What are their challenges? What are the ranges of challenges and cases within that? And then that gives us a platform upon which to start telling, at least in terms of I think a fairly common process, a narrative of what that use looks like, right? So mm-hmm. if I'm going to design a product, before I'm thinking about what color the buttons are, or even what size the buttons are, I have to be thinking about what button needs to exist and when.
Right.
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 So, and in that context, it's first of like, well, what needs to happen? If this is a banking app, what are the requirements of that app from a human-centered from a human-centered context? Mm-hmm. What are their needs? How then do I fulfill those needs? And again, this is a very specific context of design, but almost all of the design that I do, the majority of design that I'm really passionate about, is design in the service to others, right? So it has very little to do with me and my interests and even my aesthetics. It's in the service to others.
But don't you think don't you think it should always be that way?
I think it depends on the kind of work you do. I think that there are absolutely contexts for design in which that can be absolutely played with. So certainly not all design has to be human-centered design.
Okay.
And of course that does start to blur the boundaries. If people start to say, well, where does the boundary of fine art sort of fit in? And that's something that's not worth trying to unpack. But because it's a huge topic. But yeah, certainly, not all design is human-centered design. And actually a great deal of design that we think is human-centered design isn't particularly human-centered, right? In terms of truly being human-centered.
I think I took you off your path. You were talking about the design that you're passionate about is user-centered tonight, and it's design in the service of others.
Right. And so in that way, it's first and foremost about sort of identifying those needs and those requirements, and then allowing yourself to then, in a conceptual way, start to explore how those needs get fulfilled, mm-hmm. Through a wide variety of whether it's visual language. The key thing, and when we talk about process, and particularly for beginners who may be more familiar with print design, the biggest transition or the biggest change is really this integration of sequence. Often when I work with designers who are starting out in this as a space, they very much think of the screen or screens. And, actually the screen itself that's a singular moment where we really need to think about narratives. We need to think about what is happening and how did we get from here over to, this other end result through a collection of screens or through a collection of moments or through a collection of interactions. But often, people think about, this screen, then we're going to go to this screen, and then we're going to go to this screen as these sort of fixed, discrete things. Mm-hmm. And really, it's much more successful to be thinking of these as sort of flows, as sort of just pathways that we sort of move through. And so, in that context, we identify the user, we identify the needs, that we then sort of identify the requirements, what needs to happen when, and then we can start to go in and start to define hierarchy, and hierarchy first in terms of, what needs to be seen on this page, what's the content that needs to be on this page, what does the user need to know how to do on this page, or through the sequence, and then finally, and again, different people mix this in different places. How then does that connect to a certain level of aesthetics? Mm-hmm. Is the color green? Is the button green, or is it blue, or is it red, or those kinds of things? Interestingly, when I'm working in this type of work, color comes last, and so almost all of the work that I do initially is in grayscale, is in gray tone. But I am not a wireframer. So I don't work in abstract. I do work in hierarchy. I do work in typographic hierarchy. I do use color to create hierarchy, or at least, okay, let me step back. I do use tone to create hierarchy. But at the very, very end of the process is when we then go back in and then think about things like some of the color and aesthetics or texture or those kinds of things. Because really when we're functioning on or when we're trying to sort of focus on usability, at that point, it's really much more about contrast.
Right.
Sort of contrast and context. Those are the things that we want to focus on.
What was I going to ask you?
Yeah, and I recognize I'm rambling a bit. So
no. That's okay. It's okay. I just want to make sure I capture some of the key questions.
Like if you want to re-ask things for me to go back over them in simpler ways, I'm welcome to do that.
That's okay. I might, in a couple of interviews in the past, I've had to shoot a couple questions after the fact, like, what did you mean by that? Or so that's fine. Do you have any specific examples of, you talked about data-driven feedback that's going to influence the design. Have you been involved with a project where this data feedback indicated problems that you had to go back and revise, and what was that like? And did it relate to some of those finishing touches with the hierarchy and the typography and the color, or was it more of a flow problem?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because often, and this is my opinion, a lot of that data-driven flow is very good at identifying some of those smaller sort of aesthetic details. Mm-hmm. But depending on how that system has been set up, may not get to the level of really sort of deep radical change, right? Mm-hmm, so the idea is there may be multiple methods to get somebody to a particular result, and often we wind up testing small differences between one method as opposed to radically different methods of doing that. Right. That's usually done at a much earlier stage, if that testing is done at that. Because obviously there's whole books written on just that sort of user testing sort of aspects and how we do that. So I think I think it's very common across each of those different stages, as a designer, to just be really mindful and open to the idea that that the results that you will get back from the things that you do will hopefully be things that will really surprise you. It can be really painful,
Oh gosh.
Particularly for those of us who, again, come from very traditional forms of design, where I'm like, well, I should be able to make it the way I make it, and why don't people like it? But the idea of being able to come fresh into something, recognize, okay, this is what we're learning, and then here's how we have to respond to it.
Oh, that is the worst, getting that feedback.
Well,
Um,
I think it's really interesting, and to me, that's actually one of those transitions. Um, it's really funny to say this because I haven't designed print in 20 years,
mhm.
so I really don't think about print very much. But for a lot of the early part of my career, and certainly within a lot of the early part of when I was a design educator, I focused very much on the transition between people moving away from print um, and moving into interactive design. And often that transition was that transition from um, a form of design that was really communication focused. Maybe the person was working for a marketing team, designing annual reports or corporate communications, and then having to transition around the ideas of sort of usability, right? And in that context, certainly functionality exists in both places, but the kind of the requirements to, in many ways, maybe remove yourself as the designer from the end product was something that people found very, very hard, right? So when you say, "Oh yeah, that's the really difficult part,"
Yeah.
um, that was really common. I mean, now we've had several generations of designers who are interactive first, who have never designed a book and have actually in many ways maybe no interest in designing a book. And that's a really interesting thing because in my head I still sometimes often try to compare these as
Hmm.
spaces or ways of working. And when I realized that actually no, I mean it's a continuum, but we also don't need to compare. These are very, very different spaces.
Hmm. Well, these things that I would think that were so important in print, it seems like their importance are being diminished a little bit in interactive design. I mean, things that like you started as a type designer, and now you're not even really talking about your type choices or your color choices or your, you know,
That's a great point because I would say that the thing, and again, this may also just be my own personal design journey, but the thing that taught me the most about design, human-centered design, usability, cognition, all those kinds of things, is typography. And I would still make the claim that probably 80% of my job as an interaction designer, designing apps or whatever, is still typographic.
mhm.
Um, and that relates to everything from what they call UX writing, because often I'm in a position where I'm, say, writing the labels for things, right? What
Mhm.
is this called?
Right.
What should be on this button? How do I describe how this happens? So I'm both writing that, but then also thinking about hierarchy.
Hmm.
How big does this need to be? How important is this? How do I arrange these elements in a sense of visual importance? And all of that I learned from typography.
Right.
Um, and and I would say still probably 60 to 70% of of that hierarchy I still communicate through typography,
Hmm.
right? So I mean, obviously, typography is still a core skill, and yeah, typography still is very much perhaps bound to print, um, and that's where it actually gets, that's where typography gets really interesting, is that as we start to see it start to disconnect itself from the page, and as we start to be able to work with letter forms that are designed for the screen, that can change over time, that can change based on context, we're starting to see slow shifts in typography. But certainly, when we talk about sort of core basic skills, yeah, 20 years ago, it might be that we were teaching graphic form and color and typography. And today, I don't want to diminish those things, but certainly, I'm teaching, um, I would say, human-centered design and user research, um, typography, visual form, and then color. Um, but again, how those things are put in a mix often defines the type of work that designer is going to be doing at the other end,
Hmm.
right?
Um, Gosh, you kind of have answered a lot of my questions. I guess you've given me a lot to think about. uh, what what would you say in terms of typographic hierarchy? Do you have any kind of what would be the most important thing for a beginner to recognize or to get about how they apply type to the screen? I think I just see with beginners there's just such a lack of sensitivity towards how they're using type for the screen.
Yeah, I think it's both. Well, I think maybe out of the context of your book, I think that we as educators are actually really quite responsible for that, because we still teach typography in a print context, to an audience in which print is actually not their primary interest or form of design. We have whole generations of people who've grown up using apps and the web, and we still try to teach them typography in a print context, and then eventually switch it over to a web context. Or to an app context. And so it's like, well, that can be really alien to them. I think that obviously typography teaches a great deal of sensitivity to seeing. But what that leads to is an understanding of how visual properties can manipulate meaning and communicate, right? So it's not about making type big or small, but why we make type big or small and what that communicates. And so, often, certainly in my own teaching, I focus a lot on that idea of visual property, right? And so the idea is what are the tools that we have at our disposal, and then what's the impact of using those tools? So scale, color, for typography, things like font weight, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, this is true also with visual form, right? The idea is that we have a set of visual properties that our eye is really good at picking up on. And then we have the ability of connecting those visual properties to meaning. And I can tell a story through color. I could tell the same story through size. I could tell the same story through movement, right? These are simply just ways to create contrast. And connect that contrast to meaning. And that's true in data visualization, it's true in storytelling, it's true in UX. And so at its core, typography is a really wonderful sort of entry point into recognizing here is the set of visual properties, and here is how it communicates, and then here is how that's amplified when we're able to connect these visual properties to text that has meaning.
Right.
And there's an amazing sort of manipulative property to that, and manipulative in a positive way, not a negative way, obviously. In that that's where we really start to be able to communicate, and that's also where the designer starts to learn their power, their influence.
Do you
look at something and recognize something?
Do you have any great anecdotes of seeing a student finally recognize their power and harness that in their own work? I mean, do you see that all the time?
Well, yeah. I think often, though, that's something that we sort of lead students to, because unfortunately, we're often not allowed to play, sort of an industry as much as we may, in the classroom. So certainly there's a whole collection of wonderful sort of typography assignments that challenge students to take a single text, for example, and create multiple versions that will be read in different ways or across different contexts, right? And that's a wonderful experiment. Now, sometimes you can play those games in marketing, maybe less often in UX, but that's often a beginning, or sort of a very intermediate type assignment that you really start to see sort of the light bulbs go off, where they start to realize their power. Another, projects that I also used to really enjoy were projects that I would challenge students to focus on those visual properties, because I think that's really important for them to understand, because there's a continuum where often when we design through intuition. And it's very common to sit down and to make something large and then to make it small and to see how things go. And we're not really thinking about what our vocabulary is, right? Again, when I talk about visual properties, I'm talking about sort of a visual vocabulary. Scale, position, color, shape, texture, all of, those really, really basic design things. But here's the thing. If we put that in an information design context, often we have to connect that to data. And in today's world, we often have to do that through algorithms, right? So if I'm going to create a real-time map of information, I'm not going to design a million maps. I'm going to design a set of rules to connect to certain. I'm going to create a set of rules that connect visual properties to data, right? And so what that means is that I have to be able to say, what are the tools at my disposal to connect to things that happen? So so if importance is scale, then I have to have the ability of writing a rule that says, if this is important, make it big. And that leads us to sort of generative design and algorithmic design. And of course, the majority of the web, maybe I shouldn't say the majority of the web, but a significant part of the web today is algorithmically designed, right? And this is a story that I think a lot of designers, particularly young designers, haven't quite gotten their heads around. Netflix is an excellent example of this. Netflix has a total of 8 designers. The graphics that they show for every movie in Netflix, when you scroll through it, each of those graphics is designed individually for each user. So they're designed algorithmically based on your own interest, right? So you may get a particular, and there's a wonderful article about this if you want to read some of the work that they're doing. But the idea is that based on the things that you watch, different movies will be presented to you in different ways to possibly to entice you to watch them. Right now, you could see that as manipulative if you wanted to. But the idea is that basically you have a system in which there is just millions of combinations of graphics being sort of put together in real time for users. All run by basically a very small team of designers, and that's because they've been able to create systems of rules to say, if this, then that. And those rules tie back to these visual properties, right? Scale, color, typeface, image. And so for designers to be able to move from, I've used this phrase for a long time. I got it from Chris Pullman, from moving from composition to choreography. Which is initially as a designer, you sit there and you organize things on a screen until you get them right. And you say, yep, that's my fixed thing. And I like that. To where today, often our context is, I'm going to build a system that in real time, based on interaction, will end up with this designed result. But the only way to get from designing it by hand to designing it through the machine is through a system of algorithmization. That really comes down to designers truly understanding what the visual properties are and having a clear understanding of how they want those visual properties to connect to the conceptual and the information properties. And so that's that journey that they have to go on. That sounds very complex, but it entirely ties back to being in that classroom, understanding what is scale, what is color, what is form, how can it be used, and how can these properties be applied to do the things that I want to do. And certainly typography does that.
Well, this explains why all of the thumbnails for all of the movies on Netflix are like black backgrounds and knives and murder mystery kind of things when I log into Netflix because I love true crime.
Exactly. So I think the example that they used in this article, I think, is Good Will Hunting.
Uh-huh.
And so for some people, that movie is shown more as a comedy, and for other people, it's shown more as a drama. And that's entirely dependent on the kinds of their history and their interests. And but that's sort of being done again. It comes down to that some of that sort of the data-driven design part.
Yeah, but the designers have to understand the inherent properties of these graphics that they're showing in order to tag it and code it properly to appear when someone who has this kind of behavior patterns accesses it. So that's really interesting.
So it still comes back to that understanding of the communicative properties of form and how they're applied. Because again, it's really important, I think, particularly for beginning students to realize is that all of these are properties. Those properties that in many ways are abstract and can be attached to things. So again, I can show importance through scale. I can show importance through color. I could show importance through texture. I could show importance through movement. I could show value through texture. So the idea is that I have a set of visual properties, and I have to connect those to meaning. And I get to decide how to do that depending on the context that I have and the needs that I have. There is no, maybe there are some things that are more or less effective, but that's the space that we get to play in.
Yeah.
So we could say, we want to tell this story through scale, or we want to tell this story through color or through boldness. And we can make each of those be effective. Part of that is that early decision-making of saying what is right for this content, what are right for these users.
Right. Okay, Brian, I think I've got enough content for this. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about all of this. I'm going to have to transcribe.